In the fog off Kiska Harbor, the processing line advanced a step and then locked in place. Wind drove wet grit across packed cinders and the planks of a makeshift walkway. The huts ahead were timber and tar paper, dark to conserve fuel and harder to watch because darkness hid heat. A sentry lifted a gloved fist, and everybody went still. Stillness was the first protection here, because a hint of smoke could turn a narrow corridor into a crush before anyone could see the source. The detained man near the front had learned to make himself small. Since Attu, he had been passed through cages, holds, and guarded thresholds as the Americans tightened control over the island chain. His file called him an engineer and labor hand, useful enough to keep alive, but not trusted enough to be left uncounted. On Kiska, he was a transfer, waiting for the next transport south. He kept a coarse scarf high on his neck, not for pride, but to blunt the wind and to muffle the dry rasp in his chest that wanted to break into a cough at the worst moment. The corridor that fed the inspection point was built from snow fencing, crates, and rope, a channel that denied men the room to cluster or bolt. A stocky American sergeant stood where the channel widened. His helmet and poncho shone with moisture, and a clipboard rode against his chest as if it were armor. He did not shout to be heard over the gusts. He used hands and spacing, placing each man on a painted stake, controlling distance like a valve. The camp was new since the landing and still half built, but the rules were settled and written, and the sergeant treated the rules as if they were structural beams holding the place up. 2 sentries worked beside the sergeant, and a clerk sat under a canvas lean-to with a logbook protected by oilcloth. A young interpreter hovered near the sergeant, ready to catch short questions and deliver short answers. The sergeant's eyes stayed on hands and seams, not faces. He watched for matches, oily rags, tins of grease, anything that could smolder inside a bunkhouse made of fresh boards and paper sheathing. A false alarm still cost time and authority. A real fire cost everything. The sergeant's restraint was part of the control, keeping men from reacting to tone instead of instruction. When the detained man reached the stake, he stopped exactly where the sergeant pointed. A gesture told him to extend his hands, then present outer items one at a time. He removed his cap. He turned out his pockets. Finally, he loosened the scarf with slow care, keeping it in both hands so the motion could not be mistaken for concealment. The wind snapped the cloth straight. Coal dust stained the weave in uneven patches, darker where his fingers had pressed it against his mouth. The fringe was damp and heavy, as if it had been dragged through melting snow. The sergeant leaned a fraction closer, not invading space, only bringing his eyes to the level of the cloth. He angled his body to keep the scarf from flapping toward the huts, then motioned to the interpreter. A question came, compressed to essentials, about what heat the scarf had been near and whether it had touched a stove barrel or lamp. The detained man felt the question settle on him like weight. Coal dust meant contact with heat on paper, and heat meant responsibility. He wanted the scarf to remain an ordinary personal item, not a marker that would follow him down the chain. He tried his first move before the cloth could leave his hands. He rubbed the scarf between his palms to show it was dry ash, not sticky soot from oil. He held it out flat, offering it for a quick wipe and return. Through the interpreter, he kept his words spare, insisting that the scarf was only for wind, and that the dust came from the camp air, not from a forbidden fire. He did not plead. Pleading drew attention and turned a question into a contest. He tried instead to shape the exchange into something routine and fast, a small inconvenience, that ended with the scarf back against his throat. The sergeant did not argue, and he did not accuse. His restraint left no opening. He listened, then tapped a printed line on the form clipped to his board and held his finger on it until the clerk leaned in to see. The interpreter relayed the decision in the same flat cadence he used for every man. A fabric carrying ash and damp could not be treated as ordinary. It had to be held, tagged, and routed through a heat source check and scheduled decontamination because the camp could not rely on anyone's intent when a fire would spread faster than orders could. The detained man kept the scarf extended, searching for some adjustment that would satisfy the rule without stripping him. He folded the cloth neatly, compressing it so dust would not lift. He turned the folded edge toward the sergeant as if neatness might change the category. He added a detail still through the interpreter about waiting earlier near the transit hut where barrels were used for warmth and how wind had driven ash against everyone's clothing. The words were meant to explain without confessing to anything that could be turned into blame, but the explanation only confirmed that heat and ash were close enough to matter. A sentry produced a paper tag and twine and held them ready without rushing. The sergeant raised a hand again, palm out, controlling the moment of transfer as carefully as he controlled the line. Custody had to be clear. The detained man hesitated for a single breath, then released the scarf. The sentry pinched it by a corner to keep dust from shaking loose and wrapped the twine twice. The number was written in grease pencil, then copied into the logbook. The sergeant signed beside the entry with a stub of pencil and added a short note tying the item to pending heat source verification and the next decontamination run. Cold found the detained man's throat immediately. Without the scarf, wind slid under his collar and struck the raw place that had been protected. He forced his breathing shallow because a cough would echo down the corridor and become something else in the fog. Behind him, bodies shifted with restrained irritation at the delay, careful not to show it. The sergeant made the delay look inevitable. He pointed the next man to the stake, held the spacing, and used calm gestures to keep the corridor from tightening into a knot. Then the sergeant pointed the detained man to a secondary lane marked by a different rope. The lane was not a cage, but it was slower. A guard indicated where to stand, where not to stand, how to keep hands visible, how to wait, without leaning toward the clerk's table. The immediate consequence was clear even without language. His passage had been rerouted. Until the heat source check was completed and the decontamination schedule caught up, he would not move with the mainstream. The scarf, now under custody, had become a line of ink that could not be erased. He took the step into the secondary lane and stopped on the marked board. The huts ahead remained dark, and the wind continued to worry their walls. Somewhere a stove door clinked shut, a small sound that mattered more than it should have on an island where fire discipline was treated as survival. He kept his hands open at his sides, palms showing, and pressed his tongue to the roof of his mouth to suppress the itch that wanted to become a cough. He watched the clerk turn a damp page and start a new line of numbers, each one another minute he could not control. The detained man stood on the marked board in the secondary lane and let the wind hit his throat without showing it. Without the scarf, the cold went straight to the tender place behind his sternum. He breathed through his nose and kept his mouth covered with his forearm, trying to turn every inhale into a silent, shallow sip. The air carried ash from stove barrels and coal cinders tracked under boots, and the damp made the grit cling to cloth and skin. His body wanted to cough to clear it. He refused the reflex because a cough here was not just a cough. It was a sound that could stop men in motion and put a name into a log book. At the inspection point, the American sergeant stayed fixed where the corridor widened. He kept the main lane moving with hand signals and spacing, controlling tempo like a valve. He used the same gestures for guards and detainees, and the sameness mattered because it removed personal judgment from the process. The tagged scarf was carried to the safety table, sealed inside a ration sack, and tied shut to keep dust from lifting into the corridor. The clerk logged the tag number, sack number, time and hold category, then wrote the required steps in a neat hand. Heat source verification and scheduled decontamination before any downgrade. The sergeant signed beside the entry, making the hold not a preference but an accountable act. Fog rolled through in pulses, thinning the view to a few stakes at a time. The detained man held his breath longer than was safe, then had to take air. A thin wheeze escaped on the intake, sharp enough to cut through wind. Two men behind him stiffened and turned their heads toward the huts. In this place, breath that sounded wrong could be heard as smoke. The shift in posture traveled forward faster than any word because bodies learned the pattern: tighten, lean, prepare to move. The sergeant saw the line tighten in a way that preceded a surge, and he raised a closed fist. Sentries mirrored it down the channel. Motion stopped cleanly, not by fear alone, but by a practiced response that prevented fear from becoming speed. The sergeant swept his palm back, ordering a controlled retreat of a few paces away from the huts and any possible heat source. Sentries stepped into gaps and guided bodies with forearms and open hands, keeping distance without striking or shouting. At the far end of the channel, a guard tightened a rope latch to prevent bunching where the walkway narrowed. Another guard worked a field telephone crank and notified the fire watch in a low, contained manner. The sergeant pointed to stakes and reestablished spacing stake by stake, turning anxious energy into measured compliance. The immediate effect was visible in bodies, shoulders lowered, feet stayed under control, and the corridor kept its shape. The fire watch arrived with canvas buckets and a length of hose that could not be assumed to have steady pressure because water and fuel were rationed on an island that lived on shipments. They moved quickly but did not run. One checked the nearest stove barrel outside a hut, testing the latch and surface heat with the back of a gloved hand. Another tracked the flue line upward into fog and watched for drift. A third inspected the ground for fresh embers where cinders collected near the walkway. A sentry shadowed them with a lantern kept hooded, using light only where it would not draw attention down the line. The work was methodical, performed as if the result had to be defensible to someone who was not present. The sergeant kept the clerk writing during the pause. A new entry captured the stop time, the observed trigger, and the immediate actions taken: halt, controlled retreat, fire watch check, spacing enforcement. The clerk recorded that smoke had not been visually confirmed at the time of stop and that the nearest heat sources were under inspection. That phrasing mattered. It preserved the difference between a suspected hazard and a confirmed incident, and it kept the record chain honest for anyone who would review it later. Discipline here was not only posture and distance, it was also language on paper that prevented rumor from becoming an official claim. The detained man understood the shape of what he had caused. His breath had become a signal on an island where signals were treated as threats. He kept his palms open and his forearm over his mouth, trying to make his body look compliant and harmless. The interpreter drifted closer, careful to keep distance, and watched the man's breathing the way the sentries watched pockets. The sergeant's eyes moved between the huts and the detained man, measuring risk in both directions. The man wanted to explain before a story formed around him, but explanation required speaking, and speaking required air he could barely take without a rasp. When the fire watch returned with wet gloves and a negative nod, the sergeant did not loosen the rules or display relief. He moved to the next required verification. He directed the detained man to step forward into a gap between stakes, away from the cluster, creating space for assessment without surrounding him. The interpreter followed, hands visible, voice low. The sergeant asked for locations and contact points. The detained man tried to explain that cold and ash tightened his chest and that the scarf had helped him stay silent. But the explanation broke into fragments as he fought for breath. The sergeant did not treat the fragments as defiance. He treated them as missing fields. He marked the location references on the form and sent a runner to check the transit hut barrel and the path where ash had been blowing. The line resumed under tighter control. Spacing increased, and sentries held men back with palms and forearms rather than weapons. Some faces in the main lane turned toward the secondary lane as they passed, not with pity, but with the practical irritation of people whose time had just been taken. The sergeant did not permit the irritation to become a chorus. He kept eyes forward, hands steady, and the channel moving. Only after the heat source check was underway and the hazard category shifted away from immediate fire did he request a medical orderly, not as a first response, but as a confirmation step that would close the procedural gap and prevent the same trigger from repeating without explanation. The orderly arrived with a small kit and the same controlled posture as the fire watch. He checked pulse and breathing rhythm, listened close enough to distinguish wheeze from smoke inhalation, and examined the irritated skin where ash and wind had worked into pores. He offered a damp cloth and a swallow of warm water from a canteen that had been kept near a stove, small reliefs that were also test conditions. Did moisture ease the rasp? Did warmth reduce the reflex? The sergeant received the assessment through the interpreter and copied it into the margin, linking symptom and stimulus and listing the next step as routine. Continue hold of the scarf until decontamination and keep the man in a controlled lane when the wind shifted ash into the corridor. The runner returned with a brief report that the transit hut barrel had been latched and that no active smoke had been found, but that ash had been blowing across the walkway in sheets whenever the wind gusted. The sergeant added that note as well because a condition written down became a condition that could be managed. The clerk then added a cross-reference tying the stop entry to the scarf's tag number and to the detained man's holding identifier. That linkage turned the scarf from a questionable fabric into an item associated with a line disruption, and it raised the level of scrutiny without anyone needing to say so. The sergeant wrote that the scarf would remain held until the contact path was rechecked and cleared, then signed again. The detained man sat on a crate in the secondary lane, hands open, breathing measured, and watched the ration sack with his scarf disappear behind the canvas of the safety table. He understood that his first attempt to keep the scarf ordinary had failed, and that his second attempt to keep his symptoms invisible had failed with it. The camp had converted a reflex into procedure and procedure into ink. For now, the only path back to movement was to cooperate with the questions, accept the checks, and wait for the schedule that controlled everything here. Decontamination runs, heat source rechecks, and the next transfer south. The corridor restarted, but the sergeant changed its shape. He widened spacing by shifting men to every other stake, doubled the sentry presence at the bend where rope met snow fencing, and rerouted the flow away from the hut row where stove barrels sat closest to timber walls. The detour cost minutes, and minutes were treated like fuel on an island supplied by ship and weather. The sergeant accepted the cost because it reduced the chance that a sound in the fog would become a surge. The detained man was moved deeper into the secondary lane and set in a windbreak formed by stacked ration crates and the side of a storage shed. A sentry pointed to a board on the ground and made him stand squarely on it, palms visible, posture still. The move was not framed as punishment, it was framed as containment, a way to keep a repeat trigger from sitting inside the mainstream where bodies had no room to interpret. The clerk noted the relocation with time and lane designation, making the change traceable. Without the scarf, the cold worked directly on the raw place behind the man's sternum. He tried to keep his breathing shallow and silent, using his sleeve to cover his mouth. He could not force his chest to behave. He could only offer information that would let the camp treat the symptom as an environmental condition instead of a provocation. He used small, careful gestures to indicate the transit hut where detainees had waited, the barrel near its doorway, and the plank stretch where cinders collected in a shallow trough. He kept his palms open so the gestures could not be mistaken for concealment. The sergeant translated the gestures into tasks. He sent a runner with chalk to mark the drift points, dispatched 2 fire watch men to the transit hut to check the barrel latch and flue joint, and ordered another man with a shovel to scrape the cinder trough and tamp it with damp sand. Each assignment had an objective and a reportable end state. Uncertainty was handled by verifiable checks rather than by anger, and the checks were designed to produce entries that could survive review. At the safety table, the sergeant reopened the logbook to the scarf entry. The ration sack containing the scarf sat under the canvas lean-to tied with twine. The first stoppage was already cross-referenced to the tag number. A second stoppage changed the category. The sergeant tapped the escalation line on the form and held his finger on it until the clerk wrote a new notation. Repeat trigger, item linked to line disruption, hold upgraded, pending full clearance. Custody tightened with the category. A sentry carried the ration sack behind the lean-to to a smaller shelter where sensitive holds were kept out of the corridor. Inside, an ammunition box served as a temporary locker because it could be sealed and logged. The sergeant required a spoken confirmation of the tag number before the lid closed. Twine was looped through the latch and pressed under a wax seal stamped with the camp mark. The clerk recorded the seal and the time, and the scarf ceased to be a personal item awaiting cleaning. A medic arrived only after the second stop made the symptom a recurrence risk. He did not interrupt security actions. He waited until the sergeant indicated that immediate fire hazard had not been observed at that moment. The medic checked breathing rhythm, listened close enough to separate wheeze from smoke exposure, and examined the irritation where ash and wind had worked into skin. He offered a damp cloth and warm water, small reliefs that were also test conditions. The man accepted because refusal would look like defiance, and defiance would close options. A gust curled around the crates and dragged ash into the windbreak anyway. The grit struck the damp cloth and stuck. The man inhaled, felt the catch at the back of his throat, and tried to swallow it down. His chest tightened, then forced a cough he could not fully suppress. The corridor amplified the sound. Men in the main lane turned their heads toward the hut row, posture tightening as if they had heard the start of an alarm. The moment the coal-stained scarf was sealed away, his cough sounded like a smoke alarm in the fog. The sergeant moved before posture could become motion. He raised his fist, and the channel froze, not by threat but by a rehearsed signal that stopped feet as reliably as a locked gate. He stepped between the main lane and the hut row, redirecting eyes away from dark doorways where imagination filled gaps. He ordered, through gestures and the interpreter, a controlled backward step and a face-forward stance. Sentries enforced it with open palms and brief shoulder touches that repositioned bodies without striking, then released immediately to keep the restraint visible, and the fire watch executed the next layer of verification tied to the chalk marks instead of repeating a broad sweep. They checked the transit hut barrel latch, tested surfaces for abnormal heat, and inspected the sanded trough where cinders had been scraped. They found no fresh smoke residue against wet canvas and no new embers in the trough. The sergeant had the clerk write the negative findings into the stop entry, keeping suspected hazard and confirmed incident separate on paper. With the second negative check recorded, the sergeant shifted the official frame in front of everyone who mattered to the record. The corridor was no longer in a suspected fire state. It was in recurrence prevention. He ordered the barrel closest to the corridor kept cold until it could be relocated, even if that meant colder waiting for the next group. He scheduled an ash removal pass after shift change when labor could be pulled without stopping intake. The decisions reduced immediate risk at a measurable cost, and the cost itself became part of the justification for why control could not be relaxed. He then required a structured account from the detained man. Through the interpreter, he asked for specifics: when the man had last warmed himself, how close to the barrel, whether the scarf had been held near the barrel door, how often coughing had occurred since morning, and whether it worsened after ash gusts. The man answered in clipped phrases, pausing to breathe. The clerk wrote each answer as a data point, not as a confession. The medic added a short assessment that the symptom tracked cold and ash exposure, and that the man responded to moisture and warmth, an observation that could be turned into a control measure rather than a rumor. The scarf's status was the final gap. The sergeant wrote a conditional path beneath the upgraded hold. If the decontamination run cleared the fabric and heat checks stayed negative, the scarf could be reclassified as controlled protective wear rather than contraband. Controlled meant it would be logged out and back in at the lane, inspected for ash accumulation at each return, and withdrawn immediately if it again became a trigger for a stop. The man would remain in a controlled lane during gust conditions, not to punish him, but to keep the corridor from repeating the same failure mode. The interpreter delivered the conditions in short segments, and the man understood the exchange being offered. He had wanted speed and invisibility. Silence had bought suspicion and delays. The only remaining path required that he submit his weakness to the logbook and accept restrictions that made his weakness manageable. He nodded once, palms still open, and the sergeant treated the nod as acknowledgement and had it recorded. When the corridor restarted for the third time, it moved slower and steadier. Spacing remained wide. The hut row stayed behind an exclusion rope. Sentries used hand signals instead of shouted orders, and the absence of shouting kept the fog from turning every sound into panic. The detained man remained in the secondary lane, waiting for the decontamination schedule that controlled water, fuel, labor, and time. He had not regained the scarf. He had gained a defined route to earn it back under rules he could finally see. Before the next intake wave reached the stakes, the sergeant treated the stoppages as unfinished work, not a spectacle. He walked the corridor with the clerk behind him, checking each bend where rope met snow fencing and where bodies had tightened when the fog swallowed the huts. A slack knot was retied, a new spacing pattern was chalked onto a crate lid. A sentry was reassigned from the hut row to the choke point so hands could guide shoulders before fear could guide feet. The weather stayed wet and sleeting, and the huts stayed dark to conserve fuel. At the safety table, the clerk dried the logbook page by page and recopied smeared times into a clean column. The sergeant watched the pen strokes and kept the categories intact: suspected smoke, negative verification, controlled retreat, repeat trigger, negative verification, medical assessment, mitigation ordered. He initialed each segment because initials fixed responsibility to a person who could be questioned later. Discipline here was not only spacing and signals, it was language on paper that prevented rumor from becoming an official claim. The detained man remained in the secondary lane under a windbreak of stacked ration crates. A guard brought him a tin cup of warm water, and took it back when he finished. Even that was recorded because anything issued in the corridor had to be defensible as standard practice. The man sipped slowly, letting warmth soften the raw catch behind his sternum. The medic listened once more at his back and watched whether the wheeze eased after moisture and a few minutes out of the direct wind. The man was not being punished. He was being contained where his next breath could not halt the main lane. After shift change, a labor detail scraped the cinder trough along the corridor edge, tamped it with damp sand, and carried scrapings to a marked pit downwind. A sentry stood over the pit and recorded disposal time and location because cinders near timber were treated as future questions. The nearest stove barrel was shifted farther from the hut wall and farther from the rope line, set onto a pallet so heat would not soak into planks. None of it made the camp comfortable. It made the camp readable, with hazards marked and mitigations scheduled. Late that afternoon, the decontamination run began. Water was limited and fuel was guarded, so the process was not comfort, it was control. The sergeant retrieved the ammunition box from the sensitive hold shelter with a sentry and the clerk. He read the scarf tag number aloud, and the clerk repeated it before the wax seal was broken. The seal strip went into an envelope as proof of custody continuity. The ration sack was lifted out by its twine and placed onto a canvas sheet so any loosened grit could be seen and contained. The scarf came out stiff with dried damp, and ash ground into the weave. It was brushed over the canvas sheet, then dunked briefly in a basin of warm water, mixed with a measured disinfectant dose. Gloved hands wrung it until it stopped dripping. It was hung near a stove barrel designated for fabric only, positioned so heat reached the cloth without contact. A sentry watched the spacing and the barrel position because drying was a heat event, and heat events were where mistakes became incidents. While the scarf dried, the sergeant signaled the detained man forward and used the interpreter to deliver the next steps in short segments. The item would be inspected for oily residue, checked against the earlier heat source reports, then either held longer or downgraded to controlled protective wear. The medic added a signed note that the wheeze tracked ash gusts and cold and eased with moisture and warmth. The sergeant wrote mitigation controls beside it: keep the man in a controlled lane during heavy gust conditions, issue warm water as available, and require immediate hand signal if breathing tightened. When the scarf was no longer damp enough to drip, a sentry held it open, and the sergeant inspected without taking it into his own hands. There were no oily spots, only ash, staining, and damp wear consistent with conditions already documented. The sergeant compared fabric condition to runner reports and fire watch notes and confirmed the contact path remained negative. He drew one line through the upgraded hold classification and wrote a downgrade that came with limits. The scarf would be issued at the start of movement periods, returned immediately after, brushed on return, and held if ash accumulation made recurrence likely. The sergeant required the detained man to repeat the core conditions back in short phrases through the interpreter. The man complied because he had learned that silence did not protect him. Silence had only made his body speak in the wrong way at the wrong time. He accepted that his file now carried ink tying him to a line disruption, and that the only way to keep moving was to stay inside procedures that made his weakness manageable. The scarf returned to his throat under supervision, not as a private comfort, but as a controlled item with a revocable permission attached. Over the next day, the routine proved itself in changes that were small but measurable. Intake resumed at a slower, steadier pace. Spacing stayed wide at the bend, and the main lane was redirected away from the hut road during heavy gusts. Fire watch ran scheduled checks that were logged as ordinary, not as emergencies. When ash drifted across planks, labor details scraped and tamped it before the next wave arrived. The detained man moved when issued the scarf and returned it when told, raising a hand and stepping aside for a moment when his chest tightened and the corridor did not stop for him again. On the second evening, a transfer list was assembled for the next movement south, and the detained man's identifier appeared on it with a note about controlled handling during gust conditions. The sergeant reviewed the list, matched it to the holding file, and ensured the scarf record and corridor entries were clipped behind the medical note in the same packet. The man was issued the scarf for the short walk from the secondary lane to the holding hut, then returned it at the door where a sentry logged the time and inspected the fabric before placing it back into controlled storage for the next movement. That night, the sergeant sent the packet up for review with the next dispatch run. It did not claim a fire and did not name a culprit. It named conditions, actions, and verifications, and it showed how control had been applied without humiliation and how movement had been restored without pretending risk did not exist. The logbook was secured under oilcloth, the sensitive hold box was relocked, and the corridor was reset for the next fog band, ready to turn the first hint of panic back into procedure before it could become a stampede.